to another episode of the We Seek Wisdom podcast. We're here in beautiful Navarre, Florida, enjoying a beautiful view of the Sound and looking forward to discussing another important topic together. But before we get into this podcast topic, let me remind you, if you haven't already, click that subscribe button down below and click the like on the video and share this podcast with your friends. Hopefully it'll be an encouragement to them as we hope will be an encouragement to you. Well, Dr. Garlock, what are we looking at in this podcast?
Okay, we're talking about a book by a scholar, Vanishing Word by Arthur W. Hunt III. And Hunt admits in the opening of the book, he said, I owe a great debt to Neil Postman, whom we've just talked about in the last podcast, whose own book set me on a path of contemplation about the relationship between media technologies and American society. His book is really an extension of that conversation as seen through the eyes of a conservative evangelical. That's what Arthur Hunt says he's going to do. So that's where we're going to go next. The following quotes are about the author. It says about the communication and music.
Well, on page 22, Mr. Hunt says, Soren Kierkegaard said a century and a half ago, suppose someone invented an instrument, in here think the instruments of rock music, and a convenient little talking tube which, say, could be heard over the whole land. Think of the TV or now our phones. I wonder if the police would not forbid it, fearing that the whole country would become mentally deranged if it were used.
And then on page 23, the next page, Hunt says, Christianity seems to be experiencing a type of remodeling, especially inside its sanctuaries. Generation Xers are hungering for a new style of worship that bears a resemblance to MTV than to parents' old-time religion. In an opening address at the 1999 Southern Baptist Convention, Paige Patterson urged his audience to be careful of 12-minute sermonettes generated by the felt needs of an assembled cast of postmodern listeners, augmented by drama and multiple repetitions of touchy-touchy, feely-feely music.
Then Mr. Hunt on page 25 says, we are in danger of becoming pagans. Not just pagans, but mindless and defenseless pagans who would prefer to have someone, think Christian rock singers, tell us how to think and how to behave. The possibility of tyranny still exists for us today because we've lost the biblical and mental defenses to arm ourselves against demagoguery. I want to show in the following pages how Tomorrowland has the potential to become a total triumph for idolatry.
And then on page 31, Hunt says, he quotes a dictionary of premillennial theology edited by Mal Couch, page 62. Quote, Babylonians made the pagan religions fashionable. They incorporated art, drama, and music into the religion until the pagan ideas were attractively represented as the highest expression of their culture, end quote. And this is what rock music in today's culture has done. Quote, the image, rock music, always humiliates the word, always tries to exalt itself above the other, and must have the attention.
Wow. On page 34, he says, Jehovah God gave the Hebrews a new culture, a new way of life. He wanted them to be a particular people, distinctive in every way from the surrounding cultures. In our case, we need to be distinct from the rock generation and their sensual music.
And then on page 35, when God took the initiative to reach down to mankind, it was not a mistake that he purposefully chose the medium writing to make himself known.
On page 42, he says, the Canaanite sacrifices of their children was a romp in debauchery where drums pounded, women wailed for Ashtaroth, priests danced, and slashed themselves with knives, and spectators, overcome with emotion, emasculated themselves in a pledge of lifelong devotion to the goddess. This is unfortunately an appropriate and accurate description of what happens at a rock music concert today.
Well, it sounds just like a rock concert, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
Then on page 44, Hunt says, he quotes Daniel 4:30, where, quote, Nebuchadnezzar raised a 90-foot effigy of himself and declared, Is not this great Babylon that I have built for the house of the king of my might and my power, for the honor of my majesty, end quote. Then Hunt says the Bible records that when he had assembled his vast bureaucracy around the image, a royal orchestra cued everyone into prostration. 3 lone Hebrews were found standing erect, calm, staring straight ahead.
Mm-hmm. And you taught me years ago and pointed out that if you look back in the original languages, there in Daniel, a different language is used to describe these instruments for this pagan worship. As we look in the King James text, it seems like, oh, they're just trumpets. They're just, and I forget exactly what all is listed there. But as you look in the original languages, God purposely changed the language because these instruments were dedicated and used for idolatry, where
exactly
the vast majority of the rest of the time in the Old Testament, even in the New Testament, they're meant for praise of God.
And that's why I think we need to be careful. I'm not against guitars when they're used correctly.
Absolutely not.
But the big guitar, particularly the bass guitar, and the loud volume that they deliberately want to make it, have made them into the same kind of instruments. And you're completely the opposite of Christianity.
Yeah.
And what we believe. Okay?
Well, and you know Johansson from various books. He's written a book more recently here. Of course, I'm forgetting the title, but he mentions visiting a church, and he was beginning to be concerned when he showed up and they handed him earplugs. And then he went into the service, and suddenly it got dark and all the fancy lighting, and then he realized pretty quick he needed those earplugs. Sad to see that coming into the church. Well, back to what Hunt said. On page 88, he says, the Puritan practice of not allowing musical instruments or painting inside their sanctuaries have led critics to see them as hostile to the arts. However, what they objected to was not music as an art per se, but the paganism and pomp of Romish worship. Puritans believe Satan's chief project was to keep men from the scriptures. And this is what we're seeing from contemporary Christian music that follows this secularism of rock and roll. We're seeing that today. And then over on page 102, he goes on to say, America's founders, despite their wisdom, did not foresee an age in which the moving pictures or the music would subvert the written word. Mental pictures of parents, as he goes on page 110, mental pictures of parents, progeny, parlor, and the piano really do depict any era.
Isn't it interesting how he brings music into it? Because then on page 125, he says, while middle-class America hardly ever ventures into the seedy section of the city anymore, the red light district has now been conveniently piped directly into the living room.
Yes.
And then I go on further to say, this is also how the red light district has been brought into the teenagers' bedrooms through rock music. Cinema, and well, on page 126, cinema and music would evolve itself into a grand theater of sex and violence, a trend that continues to this day, and has within the last several decades yielded to the lowest moral denominator to attract audiences, turning out to be a primary instrument of the porn industry, a combination of songs, dances, jokes, and scantily clad singers.
Yes. On page 127, author Hunt likens what's happening to the beginning of modern show business, to how almost every barrier was removed that kept the faithful from entering Vanity Fair, of how John Bunyan's Pilgrim Progress, if Christian, on his journey to the celestial city, would only suspend his assumption that the Christian life required a renunciation of pleasure, that a few hours in a palace devoted to mere amusement would destroy his character, then the palace would willingly meet all other objections. This Christian was willing to do, and regretfully, contemporary Christian music, re-Christians vaudeville, took hold. And on page 132, he goes on, the display of moral laxity and the much publicized scandals of private lives of movie stars and rock musicians led the rock generation from 1960 up to nowadays to dub Nashville the New Babylon.
And then on page 135, Hunt says, the Hollywood rating system was a green light to move forward with more sexually explicit material in the name of, quote, artistic expression, everything else, and music.
And music, sure.
And then on page 138, he says, in 1906, when Lee DeFrost improved the vacuum tube, allowing receivers to pick up voice and music, radio became a reality. Quoting Marconi, the idea is to bring music into the house wireless.
And over on page 139, Hunt says the phonograph extended Tin Pan's Alley's hit mentality, including sensual rock music, right into the radio age. Vaudeville and rock music, in effect, leaped off the stage into the music box, working a kind of tribal magic on his listeners. He continues on page 139 and into page 140. On Halloween Eve, 1938, some Americans became so engrossed in CBS's Mercury Theater on the Air that they temporarily lost their ability to discern fact from fiction. 1 million people actually believed Martians invaded the planet. Of course, we're talking about Orson Welles' War of the World. However, gullibility was not just something American. The tribal drum would work his magic in Germany in a different sort of way. Radio provides the right tribal bond of a world of the common market of song and of resonance, as a type of bonding agent for the youth culture. As with the movie industry, rock music industry cultivated its own star system, and including folks claiming to be Christians in the contemporary Christian music realm.
It's so interesting that the Christians seem to follow the world.
Yes.
The world moves over and Christians follow along and do what the world is doing. Then on page 141, Hunt says, Elvis Presley was fashioned into the king of an upbeat rhythm and blues style, dubbed rock and roll. In 1956, Elvis was a scandalous loose cannon of rock and roll. But Jerry Lee Lewis gave us the Church of the Holy Roller brought straight to the altar of sex. Form and disco to the headphone of the concert, to the rapping powwow of the wheels of woofer and chant. The tribal beat blares away and continues to attract youth to its flame. Only now the medicine are not singing, I want to hold your hand, but songs about suicide and incest, homosexuality and bisexuality, cop killing and snuffing out of family members. Rock and roll has persisted now for more than half a century. One would think the dance would have petered out by now. No, the drums are much louder than they used to be, and the natives are still restless. The music video channel is a vital venue for selling artists.
And Hunt goes on page 142 to say, now that the 20-something crowd has fled MTV, the channel has given way to a giggly and sophomoric tone devoted to sex and titillation. This is why MTV took a former Disney Mouseketeer named Britney Spears and exalted her to Bubblegum Queen, A person who combines the face of virginal innocence with the gyrating moves of an aging stripper. Wow. One can hardly escape background music, for it floats in our stores, in our restaurants, in our political commercial. C.S. Lewis said that nonsense noise was the music of hell. So says Toadpipe in the Screwtape Letters. The melodies and silences of heaven will be shouted down to the end. He continues on page 163 to say, the devotion that we put into the ritual of watching television, going to the movies, attending rock concerts, or devouring the latest People magazine approaches the level of the devotion the Egyptians, Babylonians, Greeks, and Romans had for their deities.
And then on pages 183 and 84, I hope you're still listening to this. Mm-hmm. It's unbelievable, but this man really saw through what was happening.
Yes.
And we're quoting it for you. On pages 183 and 184, he says, despite lying to his staff, his wife, and all the American people, despite the fact that he perjured himself, despite his illicit affairs, President Clinton received a standing ovation at the 2000 Democratic National Convention. The president's appearance preceded a video tribute to himself.
Wow.
Narrated by himself. In the background, Fleetwood Mac's Don't Stop Thinking About Tomorrow, a well-known rock band, blared away. Upon entering the stage area, the television cameras captured women crying and delegates dancing.
Wow.
The roar gave way to the king of high-pitched screaming, usually reserved for rock stars, wrote Bob Jones IV in World magazine.
Wow.
Then on page 184, it says, in the world of political correctness, it would appear that the group that screams the loudest or whines the most, the rock music generation, ends up writing the university's policies, end quote.
And then on pages 203, 204, he says, a new kind of church is in our midst. David F. Wells says that these churches are like mushrooms springing up all over the American landscape. Inside, a cyclone of change has ripped out the crosses, the pews, the 18th century hymns, then organs, the biblical discourses. In their place are contemporary songs, drums, cinema-grade seats, light discourses, professional singers, drums, and humor. Generation X expects to find at church all the communication forms they experience every day in popular culture. Pastor Spike Hogan's terminology is reach and keep a younger generation with rock bands, a come-as-you-are dress code, and occasionally a little dancing here and there. Regretfully, PowerPoint presentations have replaced the traditional hymn book.
And then on further for pages 204 and 205, Hunt says CCM has been instrumental in altering our worship services. Boy, what a statement that is. Mm-hmm. It is today a very lucrative industry, continually seeking to broaden its market. CCM is now mostly owned and operated by the Main Street entertainment industry. Boy, is that revealing. Mm-hmm. A former CEO for Star Song Records candidly admits that most songs being cranked out by the CCM machine are virtually meaningless. Mm-hmm. I would venture to say that one stanza of a hymn like And Can It Be by Charles Wesley has more doctrinal content than 10 songs on the Christian mark today. And that was a quote, by the way. Mm-hmm. That wasn't me coming. That was a quote.
And along those lines, Word Music, which is the publishing company of great and powerful songs such as Tom Petke's Majesty and Glory of Your Name, is now owned by a company called Word Entertainment. So they're not really hiding it anymore. They want to entertain. It's not about worship. It's not about edification. It's not about encouragement and even opportunities to evangelize. They want to entertain. They want to make the monies from that.
Well, we will probably come across that in some of our future podcasts. We don't want to try to cover everything. Mm-hmm. But I think that's why so many of the Generation Z have turned away from God. Mm-hmm. And why so many preachers, this is amazing to me. But the preachers who used to preach the gospel are saying they don't believe it anymore. And I think we're going back to what we've talked about already today, and that is they don't really know God personally themselves. They don't have a relationship with the God of the universe.
Well, Hunt goes on to say on page 205, Pastor John MacArthur claims that evangelicals are failing to write substantial hymns while purging the old hymns from our congregational music repertoire and replacing them with trite praise chorus and pop song lookalikes. Granted, all worship has an emotional element, but the intellect is subjugated to passion the closer worship moves to a bodily experience. And this should be a concern because pagan worship is also a bodily experience. Well, and God says in John that those that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth.
Yes.
And now that we've gotten rid of the standard of the hymnal, it's kind of tough to change a hymnal. You can speak to that as you've written a fantastic hymnal of Majesty hymns. That's a hard thing to change. And that's a good thing because it's a standard, and you have godly men such as yourself and the many others who gave input on what should be in there. We have that standard, but then we get rid of it and we can put whatever up on the screen.
Yeah.
And we have this tripe that there's so little substance to it. It might be, a fun little, but what did we sing?
And then I'm not against PowerPoint as such.
Right.
But I think the PowerPoint, you don't take it home with you.
Exactly.
The hymn book you take home with you. And if you learn the song, see, with our church up in Greenville years ago, God gave me the insight to have people, we memorized a hymn every month.
That is excellent.
And I had maybe 50, 60 hymns that people knew by memory because they took them home and sang them at home for their devotions.
Yep.
When you have PowerPoint, you can't do that.
Yep.
It's really hurt us.
Yeah.
I mean, things need to move forward, but they need to move in the right direction.
Yeah, and go about it the right way. Because I've had people say, we don't like people buried down in the book. We want their faces up. Great. Well, go about it the right way as you did. Have them memorize a hymn a month.
Yeah.
And then they will look up. They won't need the hymnal.
Exactly.
It is a crutch, just like the PowerPoint's a crutch, because we're imperfect. We forget stuff. But having that notation there alongside the words and being able to see the whole thing at once, that there are many times that I'll think about something, I'll start meditating on something I just sang, and if it's on the screen, then it's gone. I can't reflect on it. But in the hymnal, sometimes I'll stop singing and reflect on, that was powerful.
And then I think we need to go back to a statement we've already made today in one of our podcasts, that there's a reason God chose to communicate with man in the written word.
Yes.
Or the written music, I think. God could have done it. He could have put it up in the sky. He didn't do it.
Yeah.
He could have had an announcement, a loudspeaker up in the heavens. He didn't do it. He chose to communicate to us through the written word, and that has been continued, and that's what you and I are trying to show people. We need to continue. We're building on a foundation of people who went before us.
Yes.
We're going to talk about that some more. I've got some ideas about that.
Good.
How we build on what... We don't have John Peterson anymore. We don't have Handel anymore. We don't have Haydn. We don't have great as faithfulness men. The men who wrote aren't alive anymore. So what do? We are going into phono hymnology especially, and showing how we're going to continue what those men actually were driving for. Some of them didn't know the terminology, but you go back and study it, like you and I last Christmas went through the Messiah, showing, see, how Handel knew those things, and he didn't codify it by writing it out, but he showed it in music. And then he says on page 241, I like this. He says, let me offer some remedies for idolatrous predicament. Starting with the individual and then moving outward to the home, church, and finally school. Number one, personal resistance. Number two, resistance at home. 3, resistance at church. 4, resistance at school. If we know what lies behind a particular medium and are able to point out how it works and why it always sways people the way it does, then we can lessen its power over us and replace it. And let me go back to a statement I've used for years. Whenever you're taking something away from yourself,
Yes.
replace it with something good.
Yes. Yes.
You take away the rotten music, replace it with good music. You've been drinking the wrong thing, replace it with good liquid. You've been eating the wrong food, replace it with good food.
Yes.
Don't leave yourself with a vacuum,
Yep.
because that will draw you back to where you came from.
Exactly.
And that's a Bible principle. Put off the old man and put on the new man.
Put on the new. Yes. It's not just put off. Excellent. Thank you so much. This is such an encouragement.